The hydraulic jaws of the demolition shear bit into the rusted steel of the service elevator doors, forcing them apart with a tortured shriek. For 31 years, the sub-basement of the Hartwell building had held this secret sealed. In November of 2021, that seal was broken. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness of the shaft, illuminating decades of dust, debris, and at the bottom, the unmistakable form of a human skeleton, partially buried in the detritus of time. It was a tomb discovered by accident. But it was the detail that turned a grim discovery into a haunting enigma. Tucked neatly beneath the skull, resting perfectly within the arc of the collarbones, was a scuffed, leather-worn baseball. Its position was too precise to be an accident. It felt ceremonial. At that moment, the case of the disappearance of James Lee, a young man who had walked into the Commerce Street underpass on a rainy night in 1990 and vanished from the face of the earth, was officially reopened. February 1990. The Dallas rain fell in cold, relentless sheets, slicking the asphalt on Commerce Street. Inside the garage, 28-year-old James Lee wiped the last of the grease from his hands. It was the end of another long week spent coaxing life back into aging engines, a job he performed with a quiet, steady competence that defined his entire existence. He was a man of simple routines and simpler pleasures. His meticulously maintained 1968 Ford Mustang, his position as shortstop for a local amateur baseball team, and his unwavering devotion to his younger sister, Sarah. He called her from the shop's grimy office phone, the conversation a familiar Friday night ritual. He was tired, he said, but the team had a doubleheader on Sunday, and he felt good about their chances. He promised he was on his way home, just as soon as he grabbed a few things from his car. The call was unremarkable, comforting in its predictability. It was the last conversation they would ever have. The plan was simple. His Mustang was parked in a lot across the street, a space he'd used for years. He needed to get his baseball glove from the trunk. The quickest way to get there was the Commerce Street underpass, a shadowy concrete tunnel that offered a brief respite from the rain. He'd walked this path hundreds of times. He pulled the collar of his denim jacket up against the chill and stepped out into the night. The headlights of passing cars painted fleeting streaks across the wet pavement. He was just another working man heading home at the end of a long day, his thoughts likely on a warm meal and a weekend of baseball. He walked toward the yawning mouth of the underpass, a figure momentarily illuminated by the city lights before being swallowed by the dense, artificial twilight within. He stepped out of the rain and into the shadows, and the world that knew James Lee simply stopped. The phone in his sister's apartment remained silent. The minutes stretched, bleeding into an hour, then two. The familiar sounds of a Friday night faded, replaced by a growing, hollow silence. A silence that would last for 3 decades. The demolition site on Commerce Street was frozen, transformed from a construction zone into a tightly controlled archaeological dig. Under the harsh glare of portable floodlights that cut through the sub-basement's gloom, the Dallas Police Department's forensic unit began its work. The air was thick with the cold, metallic scent of rusted steel and the dry, musty smell of disturbed earth. This was no longer just a skeleton. It was the epicenter of a 31-year-old crime, and every particle of dust was now potential evidence. The forensic anthropologist, Dr. Aris Thorne, directed the painstaking process of clearing away 3 decades of accumulated filth, a delicate operation performed with brushes and trowels. Every scoop of debris was sifted. Every fragment of rotted fabric was documented. Every fiber was collected. The remains were lifted from their makeshift grave with a reverence typically reserved for ancient kings, each bone numbered and photographed in situ before being transported to the coroner's office. The scene was methodical, quiet, and intensely focused. The bones began to tell their story. The hyoid bone was intact. James Lee had not been strangled. The ribs showed no pre-mortem fractures, ruling out a prolonged beating. But a network of spiderweb fractures on the occipital bone told a clear, brutal story. A single powerful blow from behind. The victim likely never saw his attacker. The cause of death was established: massive cranial trauma. The manner of death: homicide. This initial clarity, however, only gave birth to more complex questions. The first was a question of access and knowledge. Who knew this specific freight elevator was out of service in 1990? Who knew its shaft was accessible from a service alley that bordered the underpass? This was not a random choice. This was a location selected for its finality, a vertical grave in the heart of the city. The second question was more disturbing, the one that lingered in the minds of everyone on the scene. Why the baseball? It was placed with an unnerving deliberateness that defied simple explanation. It wasn't a trophy dropped by a killer. It felt like a statement. A signature left at a crime scene that the perpetrator believed would never be found. And this led to the final, chilling realization. This was not a spontaneous crime followed by a panicked disposal. The heavy freight elevator doors had been bolted shut from the outside with industrial-grade hardware, the metal fused by decades of rust. Sealing the tomb had been a conscious, calculated act. It was an engineering project designed to erase not just a man, but the very memory that he had ever existed. This was a cover-up, executed with chilling precision. In the sterile archives of the Dallas Police Department, Detective Calvin Hughes located the original case file for James Lee. It was a thin manila folder, its contents yellowed and brittle. The report, typed on a manual typewriter, was a monument to bureaucratic indifference. It detailed the initial 24 hours of the investigation with a detached procedural brevity that bordered on dismissal. The patrol officers assigned had performed the bare minimum. They had interviewed a frantic Sarah Lee. They had spoken to James's boss. They had noted his 1968 Mustang, untouched and legally parked. The investigation, if it could be called that, lasted less than a week. In the early 1990s, Dallas was a city grappling with a surge in violent crime, and the disappearance of a single 28-year-old man with no criminal record and no known enemies barely registered. The prevailing theory, reached with remarkable speed, was that James Lee had simply walked away from his life. He was single, had few financial ties, and no dependents other than a sister. To the overworked detectives of the era, it was the path of least resistance. The official classification came down on day 10, voluntary missing adult. The case was effectively closed. Sarah Lee's desperate insistence that her brother, a man of unshakable routine and responsibility, would never leave without a word, was noted in the file as the predictable response of a grieving relative. Her certainty was treated as emotion, not evidence. She pleaded with them to search the derelict buildings, to consider foul play, but she was met with a wall of professional calm that was more impenetrable than outright hostility. That wall of silence became the killer's greatest ally. No one canvassed the businesses bordering the Commerce Street underpass. No one checked the service records for the Hartwell building or noted its disused freight elevator. The low-level robberies plaguing the area were seen as a separate, unrelated problem. The system, designed to find the lost, had instead chosen to forget them. This wasn't a conspiracy orchestrated by some powerful entity. It was something far more common and perhaps more insidious, the quiet complicity of a system that prioritizes manageable caseloads over inconvenient truths. The decision to label James Lee a runaway was not just a mistake. It was an act of institutional negligence, an act that granted his killer 31 years of freedom and condemned his family to a 3-decade purgatory of not knowing. The silence wasn't just an absence of clues. It was the foundation upon which a perfect crime was built. Detective Calvin Hughes sat in a floral print armchair that seemed too soft for his hardened frame, nursing a cup of coffee he didn't want. Across from him, a man in his late 50s named Marcus Thorne, once the catcher for James Lee's team, squinted at a faded photograph. 31 years had softened his features and silvered his hair. His memory was a collection of warm but blurry snapshots. He remembered James as quiet, reliable, one of the best shortstops he'd ever played with. But the specifics of that last week in February 1990 were lost in the fog of 1,000 intervening days. The memories were there, but they were ghosts, insubstantial, offering comfort, but no clues. This was the pattern Hughes encountered again and again. The passage of time had acted as an accomplice to the crime, eroding the edges of memory, turning potential key witnesses into custodians of vague sentiment. They remembered the shock of James's disappearance, the sadness, but the crucial details, a strange car, an unfamiliar face, a conversation overheard, had long since dissolved. Human memory was fallible. Hughes needed something that couldn't forget. He turned to paper and ink. In a climate-controlled room at the Dallas City Archives, the investigation began to build its foundation. Hughes's team started with the baseball. It was a Rawlings R100, the official model used by the North Texas Amateur Baseball League from 1988 to 1991. Cross-referencing this with league rosters from the period, they found him. James Lee, shortstop for the Oak Cliff Oilers, a team sponsored by a local auto shop. The discovery solidified a crucial link. The baseball wasn't a random object. It belonged to the victim. Its deliberate, almost tender placement became even more unnerving. The search expanded, spiraling outward from James Lee to the physical location of his tomb. The team pulled every available document on the Hartwell building. Decades of blueprints, ownership transfers, tax liens, and building code violations piled up on their desks. It was a mountain of bureaucratic paper, a history of urban decay told through faded ink and official stamps. For 2 weeks, they sifted through the noise, searching for a signal. Hughes, a man who believed the truth was always hidden in the mundane, focused on the operational logs. He found the name of the building's last part-time custodian, a man named Arthur Gable, now 87 years old and living in a state-run nursing home. Gable's long-term memory was gone, a casualty of age, but his daughter mentioned he had been compulsively meticulous, donating all his old work logbooks to the City Historical Society. Hughes retrieved the dusty, leather-bound volumes. He turned to the week of James Lee's disappearance. The official typed entries were sparse, reflecting a building already in its death throes. Tuesday, repaired leak, 4th floor restroom. Thursday, replaced bulbs, main lobby. Nothing for the weekend. But then Hughes saw it. In the margin for Friday, February 16, 1990, a small, spidery script written in ballpoint pen. It was a note, written by Arthur Gable to himself. It read, "Heard noise from sub-basement late Friday. Power drill. Called night manager, said to ignore. Monday morning, noticed new bolts on freight elevator doors. Heavy duty. Not my work." The interview with Marcus Thorne, the former catcher, yielded one more detail, a thread that the original investigation had never pulled. There was a rivalry on the team, a bitter one, between James Lee and their star pitcher, a man named Frank Gallo. Gallo had a blistering fastball and an equally volatile temper. A former teammate, tracked down in another state, confirmed it. He described an incident where Frank blamed James for a crucial loss. The two men shouting, chests puffed, almost coming to blows in the dugout. For Detective Hughes, this was the first solid ground in a case built on shadows. A motive, clear and primal, anger, resentment, a grudge that festered. The team dug into Frank Gallo's life. They found he had a sealed juvenile record and, more importantly, a conviction for assault in 1995. A bar fight that had put a man in the hospital. A pattern of violence began to emerge. The investigation pivoted, focusing its entire weight on Frank Gallo. He became their prime and only suspect. The theory was clean, direct, and tragically plausible. A chance encounter in the rainy underpass, old tensions boiling over. An argument, an accusation, a shove. A single impulsive blow that went too far. It explained the lack of robbery, It explained the rage suggested by the forensic evidence. It provided a narrative that made sense, a human drama with a fatal conclusion. For 3 weeks, Hughes and his team were certain they had their man. They just needed to break his 31-year-old alibi. They worked backwards, meticulously reconstructing Frank Gallo's life in 1990. They built a timeline, interviewed his old friends, and prepared for the final confrontational interview. But before they could bring him in, standard procedure required a final check of all official records from the week of the murder. And there, in the emergency room admissions log for Dallas General Hospital, the entire case against Frank Gallo collapsed. On the night James Lee disappeared, Frank's father suffered a massive coronary. Hospital admission records, signed by 2 separate nurses, placed Frank at his father's bedside from 7 p.m. on Friday, February 16th until 9 a.m. the following morning. James Lee had vanished sometime after 10 p.m. Frank Gallo's alibi was absolute, unbreakable. The promising theory was dead. The weeks of work had led nowhere. The killer was once again a ghost, and James Lee's case was as cold as the concrete slab he was found beneath. Frustration is a corrosive force in a cold case investigation. For days, Detective Hughes felt its weight, the Frank Gallo file sitting on his desk like a tombstone marking a dead end. The case was adrift again, untethered from any solid theory. It was then, in a moment of quiet desperation, that Hughes did what he always did when a path grew cold. He went back to the very beginning. He took out the thin, brittle 1990 file for James Lee, not to reread it, but to look for the questions it had failed to ask. He widened his search. He stopped looking for people connected to James Lee and started looking for events connected to the location. He pulled every single crime report filed within a 5-block radius of the Commerce Street underpass for the 6 weeks leading up to the disappearance. It was a grim tapestry of a neighborhood under siege. Car break-ins, muggings, petty thefts. Most were dead ends, unsolved and forgotten. But one stood out. It was a report for an armed robbery at a liquor store 2 blocks from the underpass, just 1 week before James vanished. 2 suspects, a young man and woman, were never apprehended. But the 60-year-old clerk, though shaken, had provided a remarkably clear description of the woman. It was lodged in his memory, he told the responding officer, because of one feature. He described her as small, artistic-looking, with unforgettable fiery red hair. The description hung in the air. It connected to nothing. No one in James Lee's life, no one on his baseball team fit that profile. For a moment, it seemed like just another piece of random city crime. But Hughes couldn't let it go. On a hunch born of pure instinct, he ran a search for known female associates of Frank Gallo. Nothing. He then took a final, improbable leap. He ran a search through the 1990 enrollment records for Dallas area art colleges. For 2 days, his team sifted through a sea of grainy, black and white student ID photos. And then, it appeared. A 23-year-old art student named Bridget O'Neill. In the photograph, she stared back at the camera with an air of defiant confidence, and her hair, even in monochrome, was a wild, unmistakable shock of red. Hughes found the old liquor store clerk, now a man in his 90s living in a retirement community. He showed him a photo lineup. Without hesitation, the old man's trembling finger landed on Bridget O'Neill. In that instant, the entire case fractured and reformed into a new, terrifying picture. The murder of James Lee wasn't about a baseball rivalry. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was a crime of proximity. James Lee hadn't been a target. He had been a witness. On a rainy Friday night, he had taken a shortcut through an underpass and stumbled upon 2 active criminals who feared he had seen their faces. The motive was finally clear. It wasn't hatred. It was the panicked, desperate fear of exposure. Based on Bridget O'Neill's confession, corroborated by the forensic evidence, the final moments of James Lee's life could finally be reconstructed. He stepped into the Commerce Street underpass, seeking shelter from the rain, his mind on the weekend ahead. The tunnel was poorly lit, a passage of damp concrete and echoing quiet. Ahead, in a deeper patch of shadow, he saw them. A young man and a woman, hunched over a figure slumped against the wall. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust, a moment for him to register the scene for what it was, a petty, desperate robbery of a passed-out drunk. He didn't say a word. He didn't confront them. He simply stopped. And in that shared, suspended moment of dim light and dripping water, his eyes met Bridget's. He saw her face. And in his gaze, she saw not a threat, but a witness. She saw the end of her artistic ambitions, the collapse of the future she was trying to build, all threatened by this quiet man in a denim jacket. A wave of pure, cold panic washed over her. Her boyfriend Leo saw the look in her eyes and understood. It was Bridget who created the diversion. She called out something innocuous, a question about the time, a simple sound designed to make James turn his head. As he did, Leo moved from the deeper shadows along the wall. There was no sound, no warning. James Lee's world was reduced to a sudden, blinding impact from a direction he never saw. The world didn't fade to black. It simply ceased to exist. His baseball glove, tucked under his arm, fell to the wet concrete with a soft, leathery thud. The act was done. Now, the cover-up began. With a grim efficiency born of desperation, they moved him. They dragged his body out of the underpass and into the adjacent service alley of the Hartwell building, a dark, narrow canyon between brick walls that Leo knew from his odd jobs in the area. He pried open a rusted service door, leading them into the building's silent, forgotten sub-basement. There, they found the disused freight elevator, its doors a sheet of solid steel. After lowering James's body into the blackness of the shaft, a strange impulse seized Bridget. She saw the baseball glove on the alley floor. Beside it lay a single baseball that had tumbled from his jacket pocket. She picked up the ball. It was not an act of remorse, but something more complex, a final, chilling, and bizarrely intimate gesture. She dropped down into the shaft, and in the near-total darkness, carefully placed the ball beneath his skull, a token for a man whose name she would never know. A way, she would later say, to let him keep a part of himself. Then, the final act of erasure. Using a battery-powered drill and heavy-duty bolts they had in their car from a previous petty theft, they sealed the elevator doors from the outside. The whir of the drill was the last sound in the sub-basement, a mechanical funeral dirge. They worked quickly, methodically, turning a forgotten piece of machinery into an impenetrable tomb. Then they slipped back out into the rainy Dallas night, two ghosts melting back into the city, leaving behind a perfect, silent secret. Detective Hughes arranged the meeting under a calculated pretext. He wasn't interrogating a murder suspect. He was consulting with a pillar of the Dallas arts community. Bridget O'Neill, now 54, received him in her gallery, a cavernous space of white walls and polished concrete floors. She was the picture of sophistication and control, her once fiery hair now a tasteful auburn, her demeanor calm and authoritative. She spoke about a new police arts program, her voice measured, thoughtful, and completely detached from the woman who had once haunted the alleys of this same city. Hughes let her talk. He listened patiently before gently guiding the conversation to the past, to the way the city had changed. And then, he laid a small file on the glass table between them. He opened it, revealing the grainy, black-and-white student ID photo of a 23-year-old girl with defiant eyes and a shock of red hair. Her composure, 31 years in the making, didn't shatter. It micro-fractured, 1,000 tiny cracks appearing in the polished facade. She remained silent. Hughes didn't press her on the murder or the robbery. He didn't mention the evidence. He simply looked at her and asked the one question that had haunted him from the beginning. "Why the baseball, Bridget?" That was the key. The small human detail that logic couldn't explain. The question broke through the wall of time, and Bridget O'Neill, the respected gallery owner, began to weep. The confession that followed was a torrent, a 31-year-old secret finally released into the sterile air of her perfect, curated life. She was arrested that afternoon, her departure from the gallery in handcuffs, a shocking spectacle for the city's elite. The trial was a sensation, a collision of two worlds. The brutal, forgotten crime of 1990 clashing with the high society present of 2022. Bridget O'Neill was sentenced to life in prison. Her accomplice, Leo, had died of a drug overdose in 1998, his own demons having claimed him long before the law could. For the family of James Lee, the verdict was not a celebration. It was a final, somber closing of a chapter that had remained painfully open for more than half their lives. Justice had arrived, but it had taken a lifetime. Today, the Hartwell building is gone. In its place, a modern glass skyscraper rises into the Dallas sky, its polished facade reflecting the clouds. Where there was once rotting brick and a forgotten sub-basement, there are now corporate lobbies and the quiet hum of commerce. The city, in its relentless march forward, has paved over the tomb, replacing a monument to decay with one of ambition. The service alley where a man's body was dragged is now part of a landscaped public courtyard. The Commerce Street underpass has been transformed as well. It is wider now, the old, damp concrete walls resurfaced. Banks of bright, cold LED lights line the ceiling, flooding every corner and eliminating the shadows where two petty criminals once waited. It is clean, safe, and anonymous, a sterile artery for traffic and pedestrians scrubbed clean of its history. The exact spot where James Lee took his last steps is now crossed by thousands of people a day, none of whom know they are walking through a ghost. Bridget O'Neill is inmate number 877149 in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Her art gallery was sold, her name stripped from donor plaques. Her meticulously built life was revealed to be a beautiful facade constructed over a foundation of panicked violence and a 31-year-old lie. And in a quiet suburban home, the baseball sits in a glass display case. It rests on a small wooden stand, next to a framed photograph of a smiling 28-year-old man in a baseball uniform. James Lee's sister, Sarah, finally has an answer. She has the truth. And she has the small, leather-worn object that held his secret for 3 decades, a silent witness that ultimately spoke louder than any human voice. A new life was built over a hidden grave. A tower of glass now stands where a body once lay. It proves that no foundation is deep enough to bury a secret forever. The lights on Commerce Street are brighter than they have ever been. They were installed to erase the darkness. But for those who know the story, they only make the shadows sharper.